But thank you both for joining us. Today, we are joined by John Dacey and Robert Craig. Both work for Abolish Private Prisons. John has been a lawyer since 1977 and has dedicated his career to public interest law, focusing on poverty, disability, and healthcare. He's represented healthcare providers, schools, and various organizations, and served as a judge pro tem and federal court appointed mediator. Since 2011, John has been a leading advocate against private for-profit prisons, co-founding and serving as the executive director for Abolish Private Prisons since 2015. Also joining is Robert Craig, who joined Abolish Private Prisons in 2018, volunteering with the organization. He's co-authored Abolishing Private Prisons, a constitutional and moral imperative, and served as a visiting professor at the University of Arkansas School of Law. Before law school, he was a fifth grade teacher in Phoenix. Yay, we love teachers. For Teach for America, which deepened his commitment to underserved communities. He's a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Law School and has clerked for Judge Andy Hurwitz and on the Ninth Circuit and Judge James Soto of the District Court of Arizona. So thank you both so much for joining us. I know abolishing private prisons is a very big topic and probably has a lot of different solutions and answers. So we're excited to have you here with us today. And hopefully you can share as much as you can in this hour with 15 minutes for questions at the end. Folks who are who are online with us, please feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A section. And as they come up, I'll help moderate those questions for both John and Robert if they are pressing, or if you'd like, you can have those answered toward the end of the call. But thank you both, and I'll pass it to you all to get going.
Thanks so much, Kat. And thank you very much to the League of Women Voters for inviting us to speak with you today. It's indeed a privilege to do so. I'm in Phoenix, as Kat mentioned, and Abolish Private Prisons is our public interest law firm. We are an Arizona corporation, a 501c3 tax-exempt charity. We chose our name quite deliberately. We use the verb abolish in order to harken back to the pre-Civil War anti-slavery movement. And we wanted our mission to be perfectly clear. There are obviously a lot of other public interest law firms around, and we are focused on what we believe to be a cancer in the legal system, which are huge profit incentives to get people locked up and to keep them locked up. So before I go further, I'll ask my colleague Robert Craig in Norman, Oklahoma, to mention how he got involved as well.
Yeah, I just want to echo John's thanks for having us. I got involved with Abolish Private Prisons because I had done some work with John on a separate issue, and in between my two clerkships, I worked with John on Abolish Private Prisons, and then as it developed more and more into sort of a live legal issue, we decided to sort of dive full-time into this. And so that's how I got started with John.
So just to define our terms, there are many aspects of correctional system justice that are privatized. But when we talk about private prisons, what we are talking about are the circumstances when governments turn over their core sovereign power to private corporations to incarcerate people and to operate those facilities. So to be quite certain, what we are not talking about at this point in time are the many other kinds of services in public and private prisons that are privatized, such as food service, communications, maintenance, linens, you name it, and all kinds of other functions outside of prison that are also privatized, such as electronic surveillance. So we wanted to focus on what is a most fundamental deprivation of liberty being turned over to private corporations. About 8% of all people who are incarcerated in this country are incarcerated in private prisons, which often prompts the question to us, if most people are in public prisons, why'd you focus on private? And we will get to that in more detail. There are 3 major private prison corporations in the United States. CoreCivic, which used to be called Corrections Corporation of America, based in Nashville. The GEO Group in Boca Raton, Florida, and Management and Training Corporation out of Salt Lake City. The first 2 are publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange. And like any for-profit corporate business, they're always looking to sustain and expand their business opportunities, seeking out new markets, which include things like going global, and creating subsidiaries for other kinds of correctional services. The private prison industry is the 4th largest prison system in the United States at this point in time. And for the most part, it grew up under the radar for its first several decades of existence. When I first started looking at this issue in 2010 or 2011, I had no idea they existed. And when I asked people what they thought about them, they didn't know they existed either. So, Rob, if we could, maybe we got a couple of slides to use to talk about just an overview of mass incarceration in the United States, how and when it came about, and what subgroups of our population are particularly impacted by this dynamic.
Yeah, and before we move on from this real quick, I think it's sort of important to point out that it's called CoreCivic now, and as John mentioned, it used to be Corrections Corporations of America. And I think that intentional change of name from the corporation really shows you that they understand that their public presence is an important part of maintaining their relationship with governments. To change it from something that is so obviously a private prison corporation name to making it CoreCivic shows you that they care about what their public image looks like, and shows you sort of the lengths that they're willing to go to in this Orwellian way to define themselves outside of the private prison context.
The mass incarceration dynamic. So you may have heard this statistic quite often, that the United States contains 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population, which is saying a whole lot. We didn't used to be this kind of country. And so the next slide, the one that you just had up there, Rob, as you can see, it was a fairly level matter of incarceration rates in the country from 1920 till just before 1980. When things changed dramatically to a point where we got to about 2.3 million people in our prisons and jails about 5-6 years ago, now we're around perhaps 1.9%. This increase in our incarceration rates, which say from 1980 to 2015 was like a 450% increase in the number of people we incarcerated in this country, and our population generally did not increase at anywhere near that rate. So we became very unlike almost all other Western civilization governments. I think we incarcerated 11 times the rate of Canada, 7 times the rate of European countries. And it's very expensive. I mean, the correction budget for various state agencies have increased dramatically at the expense of things like education and safety net programs. Why'd this happen? Very generally, part of it is race. A large part of it is race and a reaction to the civil rights movement, and to control parts of the population. The war on drugs was a huge factor in incarcerating so many more of our people. There's plenty of written that indicates this huge increase in our incarceration state is not the result of increase in crime, but a change in our laws, in our substantive laws and our sentencing laws. And then, of course, we had so many people running for office that said they were going to be tough on crime in order to get elected, without regard to all the societal costs that come with becoming a mass incarceration state. And the subgroups that are impacted most by this change are not going to be surprising. People of color, the homeless, the poor, immigrants, people with serious mental illnesses. And so it should be no surprise that Black men are incarcerated at a much higher rate than white men, the same for differences between white women and women of color. And women, by the way, are the fastest growing demographic. Currently, women are being incarcerated at 2 times the rates of men. To be certain, most people in prison are men. But the rate of increase for incarceration of women is now 2 times that of the rate of increase for men. There was a White House report in 2016 that talked about who are the women in prison, and more than 50% of the women in prison were sexually abused before they were incarcerated. And since 1980, we've seen an increase of 600% in the incarceration of women till today. 58% of those women have minor children. During this boom, this prison and mass incarceration boom, as I recall, a new prison was opening every month in the United States for a significant portion of the 1980s. And as you probably all know, people with felonies lose their right to vote. And we also have the dynamic of prison gerrymandering, a circumstance where those people who are imprisoned lose their right to vote, but they're then counted for census purposes in the locations where they are incarcerated, rather than in the places of their residence for purposes of determining legislative representation. So before I jump on to another topic, where did the private prison industry come from? Rob, did you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I wanted to sort of highlight, I think, this sort of unholy pairing of the two things that were happening in the 80s that really led to the explosion, because you had the war on drugs, as John mentioned, and at the same time, there was this huge push towards privatizing government functions, right? With the sort of Reagan era of making government as small as possible. And those two things combined, I think, really led to the explosion of private prisons, because the sort of unique pitch that private prison corporations were able to give to state governments had 2 prongs to it. Number one is, we can do what you're doing for cheaper, which we'll talk about later, whether that's true or not, but that's the pitch to the state governments. And as the state governments were trying to save money, that was an attractive pitch. And the second thing that the private prison corporations will say is that we can get new prisons up and operational much more quickly than you can. So you can imagine a scenario where budgets are shrinking and the incarceration rates are climbing, and state governments are really susceptible to a pitch from a private company that says, not only can I help you save money, but I can also be flexible and spring up new prisons in this way that's, sort of attractive to the idea that private corporations are more flexible and, quicker to react to changes on the ground. And so I think the pairing of those two things really led to that explosion that John talked about. And it's like something like 1,600% increase in the number of people that were in private prisons in 1990 up through the late 2000s. So you just have these two factors that combined together really propelled this explosion forward.
And one of the ways in which they can put up prisons faster is by skirting the voters. So this may vary from community to community, but I think it's fairly typical that in order to build a new prison or a jail, there might have to be a bond election. So the voters are going to be involved. And do we really want to put this many people behind bars, and how much is it going to cost us? And we get a say in that. Well, you build a private prison, you don't have to go through that. And then once the prison is built, the private operator can either contract with an exclusive client, such as the State Department of Corrections, or market its service to many jurisdictions in order to import prisoners from other places. So this change in our laws, starting in the 70s and 80s, that resulted in the explosion of incarceration, led to terrible overcrowding issues in our public jails and prisons. So opportunity knocks, and these prison corporations come along and compete, if you will. I use that word pretty loosely because there isn't a whole lot of competition here. And they have the opportunity to contract for government services. Now, CoreCivic is traded on the New York Stock Exchange as CXW, and the Geo Group similarly is traded under the name Geo on the stock exchange. MTC, Management and Training Corporation, is privately held. Starting in the very early 80s, either the Tennessee or Kentucky Department of Corrections contracts what was then called Corrections Corporation of America to operate America's first private prison. And as I mentioned before, the industry really developed under the radar for 2 to 3 decades and spread to the majority of the states in the country, and also contracts with a number of federal agencies, including the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the United States Marshal Service for pretrial detainees. ICE detention, by the way, holds more than 80% of ICE detainees in private facilities. And then there's the U.S. Department of Homeland Security as well.
And John, I think it's up to 90% these days in the immigration detention world. I mean, that is an area where the numbers shot up maybe even more dramatically than they did in the prison space. As we went from a nation that did not put people in detention for immigration violations to locking up, a huge swath of those folks. And so that number, when we started this work, I think it was closer to 70%. And I think it crested 90%. So they've just essentially taken over the business of immigration detention.
Yeah, it was actually around 45% when we started this work. So it doubled in terms of the percentage. And so what we wind up with are circumstances where anywhere from 0 to 40% of the state's inmates are placed in private prisons. You have some states like New York, Illinois, Washington, for example, that have state laws that ban private prisons and jails. And then you have other states that are in the top 5 users. Montana, New Mexico are at 40%. Arizona, Georgia, Tennessee are probably between 20 and 30% of their prisoners, for example, being in private facilities. And then there is some dramatic transferring. So as an example, Arizona has 12 private prisons, and we import to those private prisons people from Hawaii, Alaska in the past, Vermont in the past, Idaho, Montana. And then we also work with people on the ground in some other states, for example, who are concerned about the fact that Vermont sends a number of its men to a private prison in Tutwiler, Mississippi, as an example. Where our work has factored into any of this is we work with people and try to serve as subject matter experts. So, for example, we were asked to do a presentation to the County Board of Supervisors to pass an ordinance in the greater Seattle area to ban private prisons and jails, which was successfully enacted back in 2016 or 17. And then that became a Washington state law, which banned such facilities throughout the state. Yet Washington still has private prisons. How can that be? And the way that that happens is that the federal government also contracts with these corporations and takes the position, states, you cannot interfere with federal business in this manner. We may try to work with you on it as a matter of comity between federal and state operations, but as a matter of law, federal law trumps state law, and so California and Washington, for example, have been on the losing end of litigation where they've tried to get rid of even the federally contracted private prisons.
John,
So,
would you talk a little bit about how close some states have come to flirting with turning over their entire operation?
sure. So Tennessee and Arizona are a couple of pretty good examples. In Arizona, during the time of the Great Recession, one of the ways the state was looking to help balance its budget was to turn over the operation and actually sell off its public prisons to private vendors, and in which case the entire corrections services for the whole state would have been privatized. That law was passed in Arizona, but a year later was repealed. Tennessee had a similar piece of legislation, but it was not enacted, which no coincidence, of course, Civic being based in Nashville. Those are a couple of examples of how quickly the numbers can change. So I mentioned earlier, 8% of all prisoners are in private prisons. Well, that can change rapidly with changes in administrations. Perhaps one of the most dramatic examples of that being in August of 2016, the Department of Justice under Obama, after releasing a study of the performance of its private prison contractors, determined that their performance was way below standard, and they were going to stop using private prisons. Well, we had a national election 3 months later. The Trump administration came in. The new Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, got rid of that edict and said, not only are we going to use private prisons, we're going to use them a lot more. And they did. To be certain, the private prison industry grew under every president since Ronald Reagan.
Hey, John, we got a question in the chat. It says, would being a stockholder of either of these companies give you any power to advocate against these issues rather than just being a standard constituent? The answer is yes. And in fact, there are groups that are going that route. There's a Catholic organization called Sojourners, I think, that has used his group's ownership of stock to actually bring proposals to the board of the private prison corporations to sort of make them answer questions that they're required to answer to their stockholders. So that is an avenue that some groups are using, is shareholder advocacy, and it can be, it ultimately comes down to how many shares you own, how persuasive that advocacy can be, but it is an avenue that groups are pursuing.
And we will be talking a lot more about investments in private prisons. So, how does the private prison industry perform, and does it contribute to mass incarceration on an ongoing basis? So, a couple of resources we can recommend. The Sentencing Project puts out reports that has good data reporting, and as of 2022, 27 states were using private prisons, and that included the federal government as well. 91,000 people nationally were in private prisons, which, by the way, is down about 35,000 from where it had been. And that's where the 8% came from. In his first week in office, though, President Biden issued an executive order that called for the federal government to stop using private prisons for incarceration of prisoners, which is different than the civil detention of immigrant detainees. So it didn't affect the immigration circumstance. And since then, the Federal Bureau of Prisons has stopped using private prisons, but the U.S. Marshal Service has not. And just anecdotally, one reason for that is the U.S. Marshal in Phoenix told me, I got no place else to put them. The U.S. Marshal Service does not have its own facilities. So the private prison industry is entirely taxpayer funded and created. And our major complaint with the private prison industry is not with the corporations, it's with the government officials who have created this industry by contracting in this manner. Think of prisons as institutions like hotels, nursing homes, hospitals. If the beds are empty, the model fails. And the first priority of the for-profit prison corporation is and always will be profit. So they need to keep the beds full. And like any business that wants to expand its business, they want more markets and they want guarantees of continuing business. One of the things you can look at, Robin, this might be a good time to, if you have the slides handy, because CoreCivic and Geo Group are publicly traded on the stock exchange, they have to file an annual report with the SEC. And every year their reports have included the statement that's on your screen now, which is a warning to shareholders and potential investors. The demand for our facilities and services could be adversely affected by relaxation of enforcement efforts, leniency in conviction of parole standards and sentencing practices, and decriminalization. So, they're pretty clear about what kinds of things are adverse to their business model. And like any corporation that has the clout to do so, they get involved at state legislatures and Capitol Hill, and through the making of campaign donations to their to officials they deem friendly to their industry, to make sure they keep their business and are able to grow it. So the three large corporations I mentioned previously have about 90% of the prisoner market, if you will, in the US, the private prisoner market. And perhaps one of our most fundamental concerns with this whole circumstance is simply this: a private for-profit jailer has no incentive to release anyone. And in fact, in some of the promotional materials we've seen from CCA, for example, they actually tout to their investors high rates of recidivism as good reasons to invest. Well, those are not necessarily in the public interest, and can cost taxpayers dearly, aside from the damage it does to particular communities.
One thing that we often do, although I don't think we have time for this kind of activity, is we ask people that we talk to imagine that they were in a board meeting for one of these corporations and the kind of activities that they would recommend the corporation to take to increase the profits. And basically everybody who thinks about it for a few minutes comes up with the same kinds of ideas, right? You want to make sure that you are lobbying in all of the particular places that you think that legislation can get passed at the state and federal level. You make campaign contributions to friendly government actors, right? These corporations have a trade alliance called the Day One Alliance, and they will swear up and down that they don't get involved in lobbying. That's just untrue. You can go and look at a website like Open Secrets to see where campaign contributions are going. They regularly make campaign contributions to governors and legislators in basically every state and at the federal level. There was a big report out of Arizona that said that through ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, the private prison industry had used their relationships with that group to craft model legislation that eventually became SB 1070, which was this racist show your papers kind of law, but also fed into increased incarceration rates. So it's something that is the first thing that you think of. They, of course, do that. Another thing you can think about if you're trying to increase your profits is you're trying to decrease the amount that you spend. And the ways that you do that include having less staff members, offering less programs. And both of those things turn out to be true. We're in an era now where private prisons have been around long enough that academics have been studying this. And virtually every time that a new report comes out from the academic world, they find that the private prisons are doing everything you expect them to do. There was a report from, I think it was Wisconsin or Minnesota, an upper Midwest state, that talked about how these corporations did not offer the same kind of services to people that were in the private facilities in that state. There was also a report that came out that showed in Mississippi, if you were in a private facility, you could expect to spend approximately 8 to 9% longer than if you were the same kind of person in a public facility. And that largely came down to the increased amount of write-ups that you would receive for disciplinary infractions. So all of the sort of theoretical things that you think the corporations might be doing to increase profits, it turns out they actually are doing. I see Kat has her hand up, I think.
Hi,
Yeah.
I had a question from the Q&A. What is the data showing since 2009 about how many people are incarcerated in private prisons?
So there's two sort of threads to that. One is that the government organization that collected a lot of this data got significantly less funding. So if you look broadly at the ability to get information about people that are incarcerated, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has had a much harder time releasing good statistics after 2010, which is why a lot of the data we'll see is sort of stops around then. We have generally been in a sort of holding pattern. And with COVID, we saw maybe slight declines. So I think in general, our perception of these numbers is that they're more or less the same, or in the same ballpark. They haven't changed a lot up or down. We've seen some retraction recently, and I know John earlier said that every president has seen an increase in private prisons in his tenure. I'm not quite sure that's true with President Biden, and it might be, but I think it's close, and it's just because we are seeing fewer people in prison overall, for a number of reasons. Crime rates are way down, and there's some states that are seeing sort of tipping points in the political messaging around over-incarceration. So my sense is that we've been more or less in a holding pattern since approximately 2010. That's my thought. I don't know, John, if you have a different view.
Yeah, one correction, that would be the Bureau of Justice Statistics. I think you said labor statistics.
Yeah, that's right.
And then, I would take a look at the reports from the sentencing project. They have some pretty good annual reports that break down data by different types of categories, including private prisons, specific state by state, including statistics on women and incarceration, for example. One of the things that motivates us to get involved in this is that in the privatized system, in our view, the prisoner becomes a commodity. The way that the private prison corporations are compensated, they get their contracts through public procurement or auctions, if you will. They get long-term contracts for 20 years plus. They get occupancy guarantees in some instances, not all, but there are some contracts we've seen where the State Department of Corrections is guaranteeing the private operator 10 plus years of service and 90% plus occupancy levels. So what that means is if the occupancy level in the private prison goes underneath that guarantee, the state will then pay for empty cells in the private facility. The state won't want to do that, and so they'll move people from the public to the private facilities. Not all of the contracts include those guarantees. One of the things that indicates, in our view, how the prisoner becomes a commodity in such a system, their private prison is paid a per diem for every day that the person is in their cell. If anyone's familiar with hospital reimbursement methodologies, very similar to taking a midnight census. And they actually crunch their numbers, the prison corporation, by what they call a man day. This is how much revenue we get each day the man is in our cell. This is what our costs are. This is our net profit for each person that's there. When the Obama administration in 2016 said we're going to stop using private prisons, the stock values of Geo Group and Force Civic tumbled more than 35% just from that announcement, because it results in projections of having fewer people in their private facilities. When the new administration came in and Jeff Sessions said, not so, we're going to use them even more, the stock values of those corporations shot up, just based on projections of how many people we're going to incarcerate. So in our view, the incentives are perverse. So in any event, somebody might ask the question about how do you know how successful the private prisons are being in terms of things like recidivism rates and the like, or cost. On the issue of cost, the Arizona Auditor General came out with a report comparing the cost of public and private prisons, and concluded that the private prisons cost more. So the result of that was the Arizona legislature did away with any further comparative studies, so the public doesn't get to know. With regard to transparency, there have been a number of occasions in which bills have been floated to make the private prison subject to the Freedom of Information Act that have been opposed successfully each time by the private prison industry and their friends. So it's difficult, very difficult to get data out of them. And it's also difficult to make those kinds of comparisons when a person's journey through the prison system might put them in several different facilities, public and private. So how do you attribute the causes of recidivism
John, we got
when that occurs?
Sorry to interrupt. We had a question about
Sure.
essentially the Parsons litigation in Arizona. So I don't know. I mean, our perspective on that is that, you know, our focus at APP is largely on the privatization of the entire prison operation. Some of the interesting notes that came from the Parsons litigation, from my perspective at least, is that they found that the core reason that the healthcare that was being delivered in Arizona public facilities is that the healthcare itself was being privatized, right? So you have a finding from a district court judge in Arizona that said the underlying reason that healthcare is not being delivered at a constitutional level is the privatization aspect of it. I know John has a lot of expertise in how healthcare is delivered, so you'll probably have larger thoughts on it. But I think the sort of core motivating nugget that came out of Parsons from our perspective is that privatization is the core problem. And that, you know, that comes from a federal district court judge. And there's a lot of back and forth. They went through several different vendors trying to find a vendor that could deliver constitutionally adequate care, and were unable to for a variety of reasons. But yeah, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I mean, what made it really difficult was not necessarily the privatization in and of itself, but the Arizona legislative mandate that it must be privatized. So if the privates were failing, the public agency did not have the authority to then hire in-house to fix the problem. Yeah, that's not our case, but we are familiar with what's going on there. A couple of things I just wanted to mention in terms of the politics, and I want to be mindful of how much time we have. I mentioned earlier, really the whole topic of prison privatization was unknown to me until I started mediating for the federal court inmate lawsuits against the Arizona Department of Corrections over things like safety and medical care and the like. That's when I first came across the words private for-profit prisons. But I found most people didn't have any idea they existed until Bernie Sanders put the issue into his campaign platform in 2016 and made his opposition to prison privatization very public. One thing that happened from that is unfortunate, I think, is that it has since become a very partisan issue. Before then, the private prison political spending was perhaps 60-40 Republican Democrat. Now, Rob, what is it? It's over 90% spending on Republicans versus Democrats, and of course it's a political issue, but it's become a very partisan issue.
Now we got a question real fast that in education, private schools don't have to adhere to the same regulations and laws that public schools do. Is that the same for private versus public prisons? The first thing that comes to mind, the answer is clearly not all of them. For example, the training that is required to become a security officer at a public facility is often quite lengthy, multiple months of training before you're allowed to become an officer at the prison. In the private facilities, that's not true. You don't have to be licensed. The regulations are very lax. People are thrown into these private facilities with virtually no training. On the other hand, they do have to provide the same sort of constitutionally mandated things like healthcare and, not violating prisoners' Fourth Amendment rights and Eighth Amendment rights. So some of them they certainly do, some of them they don't. They also are not subject to the same FOIA, open access to information requirements that public facilities are. So there is some mismatch between what the privates and the public facilities are required to do.
And as we know from the Parsons litigation, you can put all kinds of things in your private vendors' contracts in terms of what they must do. But if this government agency isn't going to aggressively monitor and enforce those provisions, then you're going to have a lot of slip sliding in that regard. There have been a few times that I've been asked, isn't the privatization of corrections like the privatization of schools, charter schools and the like? And it's really not. I mean, the one thing in the prison circumstance, the person in prison really has no ability to police their own circumstances. If they don't like it here, they can't leave. They can't go someplace else, and they're hardly heard, and they're out of mind. Placed in remote locations so that the rest of the public doesn't think about them or see them. So,
one thing that in this area that I think is very worth people's time, Shane Bauer wrote a book, investigative journalist, wrote a book called American Prison, where he went not even really undercover on his job application to work at one of these private facilities as a guard. He listed that he was a journalist. So it wasn't like he was hiding anything, but the book American Prison recounts what it was like to be a guard in these facilities, and just how volatile it was, how little training, how understaffed they were as a group. So if you're looking for the ways in which private facilities don't have to adhere to some of the same regulations that public facilities do, what that means for people inside, both the employees and the people that are being imprisoned there, that is, I think, an incredible insight and worth most people's times reading if you're interested in it.
And if you want a shorthand version of it, go to our website at abolishprivateprisons.org. At the bottom of our homepage is a link to our Prison Cells podcast. And one of the episodes includes our in-depth interview with Shane Bauer about his time at the CoreCivic prison in Wynne, Louisiana.
You can also find it on any podcast app, if you have Apple Podcasts or whatever, it's on there under Prison Cells. And the Shane Bauer episode, he is an incredible storyteller. We were lucky to have him on and just sort of let him carry the conversation, because his time there was, I think, extremely illuminating, but also relatable to people to see what goes on in one of these facilities. And you know, one of the things that John touched on earlier is not just, you know, the people who are being taken advantage of by these private prison corporations are not just the people that are being imprisoned there. They also go in and they take advantage of these often rural communities that are very poor, and they offer them these jobs that they promise as being good jobs, but they're incredibly dangerous and incredibly underpaid, and you know, dead end jobs. So it's really taking advantage of basically every single person that comes into contact with this business in any way.
The clock on the wall is saying we better get to what might be on people's minds, which is, so what can we do if we're interested in this topic? And there are several things we would suggest to you, but I think one of the best examples could be the whole area of the investments of government retirement pension plans. Rob, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so this is an area that we've been focusing on recently. And as we've learned about it, you know, we've gotten more active into it, but basically almost every, it's not every, but it's very nearly every government pension operation fund is invested into these corporations, either directly, as in a couple states, you know, like a couple states actually own direct stock in a couple of these private prison corporations, or slightly more, you know, like with one stop in between, because like the Russell 3000 stock index is a very commonly held index fund, which both of these private prison corporations are represented in, to a different degree depending on exactly what fund you're invested in. Government pensions are often also invested in private equity, and these private equity groups are owners not just of the private prison corporations themselves, but also all of the different ways that people are profiteering off the prison industry. So if you think of telecommunications, phone calls, texting, most prisons now have these like electronic messaging things that are sort of like email, but they're not, and they charge the prisoners a lot of money to use these functions. So states and the federal government are invested into these companies that are profiteering off the prison system, either directly or indirectly. And so we've been really pushing people to be aware of what your retirement funds look like, because it's very likely that without you even being completely aware of it, you have money that's invested into private prisons or various other profiteering off the prison system. And as was mentioned earlier, the fact that you have money invested into it means that you do have some power here, right? So there's various ways to use that power. There's a website called Prison Free Funds that if you type in a fund, for example, the Russell 3000, it will tell you whether that fund itself is invested into private prisons and to what extent. You can reach out to the people that are managing your funds and ask them if you have access to funds that don't include these corporations. You can advocate for the creation of these funds to say, you know, I don't want to be invested into private prisons or prison profiteering. Do you have any of these other funds available that don't have this kind of profiteering attached to them? And so that's one area we've been pushing a lot recently, because we think from the perspective of somebody, a defendant, right, that's going into a courtroom, if you were the person going into the courtroom, that the judge and the prosecutor and the defense attorney through their pensions were all invested financially into the profiteering prison system, like, do you think you're going to get a fully impartial system? Even if you think people are trying to be fair all the time, the concept of subconscious bias and these implicit biases that people have to look after themselves, we think that for a bunch of reasons, getting divested from these profiteering systems is beneficial to society at large. We also know that divestment can be powerful in pushing out the corporations more broadly, because if they lose access to their capital, it's harder for them to operate. I saw a couple questions. Who makes the determination to build a new private prison? Usually the way this happens is the state or the federal government, when they're looking, they'll put out a request for proposal, an RFP that says, we want a medium security facility that has 1,000 beds. It's longer than that, but that's the shorthand of it. And then one of the prison corporations or multiple of them will say, here's our proposal for what that would look like, how much it will cost, and what the contract will be. So generally what happens is the government actor says we have a need of a new prison, and they put out a request for proposal that the private industry answers.
And by the way, sometimes the government also contracts with other services through these private prison subsidiaries for things like electronic community supervision, bail bonds, for-profit probation and parole, community corrections, construction. There are all kinds of other subsidiaries that these corporations create, just like any other kind of business. And so the reach of the profit incentive and the incentive to keep people's lives entangled in the criminal justice system is much greater than just the prison operations.
Sorry, John, question real fast about what can individuals do to take action to abolish private prisons? We have lots of thoughts on this. I think one thing that's very interesting is that, as John noted earlier, states are the biggest by far holders of people in private facilities. And also state legislators are way more accessible than their federal counterparts. So if you figure out who your local legislator is, I think forming advocacy groups at your state level and say, we don't need to be using these. What can we do to move away from these in our state? Reach out to family and friends in other states that are more, if you live in a state that doesn't use them, obviously it's harder to reach out to your local legislator, but finding these sort of more local grassroots ways is an effective way to create change. We worked with a group that I think it was in Alabama, where they were trying to build a mega private prison, like a mega private prison that's supposed to hold thousands and thousands and thousands of people. Grassroots advocacy was really the reason that it got stopped. I mean, local organizers were able to say, this is not going to happen here. And we're able to, at least for now, hold back on that. So I think because of the local nature of prisons, local advocacy can be very successful.
Take a look on our website, if you will. One of the first things you'll see on our homepage is a link to our letter to Governor Hobbs of Arizona on behalf of 26 organizations, asking her to take executive action to stop contracting with private prisons. The letter was joined by 26 other organizations, half of which are faith-based. So also adopting resolutions. So whatever organizations you might be affiliated with individually, you might ask them, number one, are your pensions invested in private prisons? Do you know if they are? Can we stop doing that? Number two, how about adopting a resolution calling for an end to prison privatization? On our website, there are numbers of resolutions linked there from all kinds of civic, faith-based, and union organizations that call for an abolition of this industry. Student groups on college campuses have had some success in advocating that their board of regents or board of trustees divest from private prison corporations. So there are all kinds of different ways to go about it. I know the League of Women Voters also litigates, so do we, but that's going to have to be for another day. The other thing, in terms of if you want to help us with our efforts, connect us to other organizations that might want to hear from us as well, or might want to actually participate with us in one way or another. So we're happy to do presentations on short notice and to help build consortiums around systemic change. So just some examples, and of course I'd be remiss if I didn't mention again, we are a 501c3 charitable organization. Donations are very important to our continued operations. You can do that through mail. US mail or through our website. Kat, did you have any other questions?
I think Robert was able to answer them in the chat. I think one other question that I had was the letter you were mentioning with Hobbs, the one that we had discussed that the league had also signed on?
Yes.
Okay, so the league has also signed on to support these initiatives. We obviously, as a group, have a lot to learn about this still, and want to find opportunities to help mobilize league members and being more active. I will make sure that all this information and this recording is sent to everyone. And in our next criminal justice committee meeting, we'll definitely follow up with how we can support. I guess, I know it's a little too early because the new legislative session hasn't started. I mean, the last one barely ended, but are you anticipating or expecting to see anything in the 2025 legislature of bills that might be endorsing private prisons or anything around that?
No, and I say that out of ignorance, Kat. We haven't been involved in the Arizona legislature. I was a lobbyist for 20 years, but that's been in my past. There are different ways to try and affect systemic change. One, of course, is through legislation, and whether you can get a bill prohibiting private prisons through the Arizona legislature is very doubtful. When Senate Bill 1070 was enacted, which Rob discussed earlier, most of the legislators who signed on to that bill and the governor all took money from the private prison corporations. So they have a lot of clout. Another way to do it is through a constitutional decision of the court or a voter referendum, or I should say voter initiative. Amending a state constitution or state laws is another way to go, but as you probably know, those are expensive and time consuming and need a lot of planning. In order to launch something like that, it's not something you talk about cavalierly.
But we do think that those are one of the more sort of attractive ways to make change at the state level, because private prisons are an issue that they only are sort of advocated for and like they affect positively a very few number of stakeholders, right? You have the corporations themselves and the government actors who are making money, even if it's through campaign contributions off their existence. The broad general public is generally very against them, in the 60 to 70% range, even in a place like Arizona that has some like libertarian leanings, right? So it is an area that we think that when the public has a chance to get their say on it, they almost, very broadly speak against the existence of private prisons. So we do see initiatives as being a method moving forward.
Yeah, Rob is referring to a polling actually done in Arizona 2-3 years ago that resulted in about 67% of the people surveyed were opposed to their use in Arizona.
So might another approach be is encouraging legislators to not take donations from private prison corporations and some accountability there? I mean, that doesn't seem as political, but just knowing that they're not incentivized to work with these corporations, I think is another good approach when those political donations are publicly accessible. And you can definitely ask your legislator, hey, don't take money from private prisons.
Well, absolutely. And in fact, when Sanders criticized Hillary Clinton for taking contributions from private prison corporations, Clinton took a look at her donations and refunded all of those donations from the prison corporations. But your question raises one other essential point. There are 20 plus states that do not use private prisons, whether they outlaw them or not, or simply don't use them. Yet those same states invest their retirement plan funds in private prison corporations, whether they know it or not, through fund managers and retirement system investment committees, which, you know, you would think predictably would view their fiduciary obligation to the plan members to be to make as much money as possible. Well, you know, of course, we are hoping that a number of places, such as state bar associations, local jurisdictions, and the like, will not only encourage divestment from such corporations, but actually ban those investments going forward. In one particular twist, since we're lawyers and we're concerned about the legal system, we just recently did a presentation to a group of public defenders where we focused on the fact, as Robbie mentioned earlier, that the retirement systems of legislators, police, prosecutors, judges are all invested in these private prison companies, which raises issues of ethics and appearances of impropriety and the integrity of the justice system, which is a more narrow concern, but we think it goes deeper than just policy considerations. And so, yes, we've written and spoken to that issue as well.
Well, we are a few minutes over time, but thank you both so much for this presentation, the information. I've dropped in the chat the link to abolishprivateprisons.org and the prisonfreefunds.org, and I'll send out all this information. And hopefully there are future collaboration opportunities to work with your organization and uplift the work that you're doing. Again, thank you both so much, and thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. If you missed the first part of it, don't worry, it has been recorded and you can go back and rewatch it. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to John or Robert, and I'll make sure that you get their contact information, or you can reach out to info@abolishprivateprisons.org.
Thanks so much for this opportunity.
Yep. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your day, and we will have hopefully a follow-up conversation on how we can continue to support the Abolish Private Prisons movement.